Going back to the Strait of Hormuz, what would be some of the positives or the negatives of Iran shutting it off?
Well, certainly the reason why I think this is an unlikely scenario anytime soon is that, of course, Iran itself is dependent on exporting its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. And so it seems almost inconceivable that Iran would take this step to fully shut traffic through the strait unless its oil exports had themselves already been cut off. That could happen, for example, in a scenario in which perhaps in the future, Israel, perhaps the United States, were to try to disrupt Iran's oil export capabilities through its vitally important terminal in Kharg Island, there toward the northern side of the Middle East Gulf. That's where substantially 90% of Iran's crude exports originate. If that facility is shut down, degraded, then Iran may feel like it has relatively little, if anything, to lose by imposing a cost on the neighboring countries that export from that region and buyers around the world that depend on those flows from the Gulf and from Hormuz. But we should keep our eye on other potential vectors of energy security disruption from the Gulf. And I think that a more likely one that we could see in the coming days and weeks might be covert attacks, unattributable attacks to the regime in Tehran. That could take the form of explosive mines being laid undersea that oil tankers could run into and be very heavily damaged or even sink, and potentially attacks by fast craft like armed speedboats. These are measures that the Iranian regime or potentially its proxies could undertake to up the ante in this struggle, force the other side to negotiations on a more even playing field without directly attributing those attacks to Tehran.
I'm curious to know your take on oil shocks, comparing the one that we could potentially see here today with those in history, 1990s, the Gulf War, of course, and the shocks that would bring economic recession, inflation, geopolitical instability. I want to get a sense of the reaction that we're seeing in the oil space now. It's moderate. It's a 2% increase. What do you think that the moves that we're seeing in the market now, what do they imply?
You know, in the last few months, we've seen market sentiment generally, like in the equity markets, affected by the philosophy of FOMO, fear of missing out. But oil market sentiment these days, especially when it comes to disruptions, is a different philosophy. It's, oh no, it's the oil halt never occurs. And so oil traders have seen quite a few run-ins with geopolitical hotspots flaring up, with Middle East tensions as well over the years, really resulting in no substantial supply disruption. Meanwhile, OPEC does have some substantial spare capacity that it could bring to the table, maybe 4+ million barrels per day, although it is actually north of the Strait of Hormuz and would also reach world markets only by transiting an open strait. The market is also thinking of the backup options. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed, can some of that capacity be redirected to other export routes? Saudi Aramco has an east-west pipeline that connects the eastern province, where the oil is produced, to ports on the Red Sea. But there's probably only enough capacity in that pipeline to accommodate about half of Saudi Aramco's normal exports via the Gulf. So when you put all that together, there is some disruption risk, but the market is in a mood of show me the disruption, show me a volume and a duration of physical supply disruption. And I believe that in this case, it's not going to price that disruption unless and until it sees it unfolding.
China is a major buyer of Iranian oil. I want to get to your take on China's role in all of this. Do they play any role in a resolution?
Well, they certainly can. And China has brokered other deals in the Middle East before. And I'm thinking especially about the relatively recent détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is one of the stabilizing forces, actually in this case, that is probably helping to prevent the Iranians from widening the retaliation across the Gulf to its neighbors. But China is very dependent on flows from the Gulf, not only from Iran, but from the other producers in the Mideast Gulf. And its national security interest really would value stabilization of the situation and a de-escalation, enabling safe flows of oil and gas through the strait. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Beijing become even more involved on the diplomatic front, but I'm not expecting Beijing to assert any type of military intervention into the Gulf. That would be a black swan event, whether from China or potentially from Russia, that the markets are definitely not expecting, and I think for good reason.